Hi, everybody. Welcome to Christian Homestead. My name is Jared. I found something really interesting in the April 1902 General Conference in this talk by Elder J.G. Duffin, president of the Southwestern States Mission. This is him right here, James Gledhill Duffin. And what I'm about to read, I feel like... So I'm learning more and more and more about Missouri. And at the same time that I'm doing that, I'm also thinking a lot about the rededication of the Salt Lake Temple, because I think there's a relationship there. And I'm going to explain it in just a minute. I had some new thoughts come to me as I was reading through this, and it's interesting. It's exciting. And gosh, I love doing this channel, and I hope that you enjoy it too. So the main part that we're going to read is here at the end of his talk. Let me just point this out really quick, just as a side note. The people who live in the great majority of the states embraced within the territory that we cover have come from the various states of the Union and from almost every nation under heaven. I just want to point that out because some people believe that we're not close to the second coming because we don't literally have missionaries within the borders of every single nation on earth. And that's what has to happen before the second coming can take place. And I'm not of that opinion, because I think the Lord moves people around, especially nowadays with all these immigrants and refugees and so forth. And then with the internet, I'm not waiting for that day when there's missionaries literally in every single country. I think that all peoples of the world have had a chance to receive the gospel and are continuing to have a chance. And it may surprise us just how many from these countries like China, Iraq, so on and so forth, have actually come in contact with the gospel. So now we're going to skip down, and this is really interesting. There's a few things to think about here. The headquarters of our mission is located in what is termed the Land of Zion. We are in Kansas City, 10 miles only from Independence, the spot where the temple will yet be erected. Well, I decided to add this to my spreadsheet called Quotes, Common Misconceptions. Oh, oops, wrong one. This one right here. Quotes, Common Misconceptions. This is currently row 26. The topic is New Jerusalem. The misconception is the church isn't going to build a temple on the temple lot in Independence, Missouri. That's kind of similar to these other misconceptions. We have been excused from building New Jerusalem in Jackson County, Missouri, which would include both the temple and the city. And then also that the New Jerusalem is going to be somewhere else, Salt Lake City, but the plan has changed. And that's not the case. I'm not going to beat a dead horse, but if you're interested, you can access my spreadsheets anytime. The link is in the description box of each video. This one in particular, well, which one? One of these two, out of all these topics, these are the ones that I have the most quotes for. Oh, it must be New Jerusalem is somewhere else other than Jackson County, Missouri. And that is definitely not true. Going from Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph Smith, Wilford Woodruff, John Taylor, Orson Pratt, all the way until President Nelson. He recently said this in 2020. You can pause and read this if you like. Here's the book in which he said it, Daily Joy. It's also on the church website. When you go to Gospel Topics and Questions and go to Zion, it says, which will be built in Jackson County, Missouri. So it is still the plan, and the temple will be built on the temple lot. Okay, I have 2 quotes for that so far. This is my newest quote. Back to the talk. I've been very much impressed during the last year with the very favorable sentiment that is exhibited in that land toward our people. It is only a few days ago since I received a letter from the city engineer of Independence stating to me that a portion of the original temple lot was now for sale. And if our people desired to get hold of that, we could do so by paying the purchase price. The original temple lot, according to the plat on the records, contained about 63 acres, and it is now possible for this people, if they desire, to purchase the greater portion of it. Okay, so that's significant. Here's my video of the temple lot on my other channel, Explore Church Sites. I'll put a link for this in the description box below. Of course, the Church of Christ temple lot, this white chapel right here, they're the ones that owned the temple lot for the first temple, the primary temple. But what he's referring to in his talk is the land that we currently own, on which we built the Independence Visitor Center. We also have the Independence Stake Center. We also have the Mission Home and a couple other things. And I want to point out the Independence Visitor Center was built according to the dimensions revealed to Joseph Smith for the temples of the 24 temple complex. So it's exciting to read this in the April 1902 General Conference because I don't know if things would happen like this in the future. If, for example, in this General Conference, if someone said, just recently we've been talking to Church of Christ, and they have decided to sell the temple lot. Well, we do have this that happened back in 1902. I don't know if it would play out like this again, but it's interesting. And I put this on another spreadsheet. Let's see. This spreadsheet is called Timeline Missouri. I'm trying to piece together the return to Missouri. When I say return to Missouri, I don't mean the entire church is going to come here, because that's not the case. But at some point, this area is going to be built up, and it kind of already is. It's going to be built up even more. There is going to be an actual temple. There is going to be a New Jerusalem. So I want to see everything that's been happening in a natural way that has been leading up to that point. And here's my newest item on the timeline. Now, what I find interesting is that this is where we start talking about the Salt Lake Temple. I've pointed this out before, but the Salt Lake Temple, okay, well, let me point this out. This is new as well. So it was 1882 that Church of Christ took possession of the temple lot. Okay, 1882. So the Saints were in Utah. I know that there's a whole story behind this, but in 1893, that's when the Salt Lake Temple was dedicated. After 40 years, it was finally finished, constructed, and it was dedicated. I think it's interesting to point out that after the Saints left Nauvoo, and once they settled in Utah, the first temple that was announced at that point was the Salt Lake Temple, announced in 1847. This is my spreadsheet for temple announcements. What's interesting, if you think about it, and I had this realization as I was preparing this video, is that the first temple announced in this dispensation was the temple that was supposed to be built in Independence. So you have the first temple announced in Utah, and then you have the first temple announced in this dispensation. Between those two, I feel like there is a little bit of a relationship, especially if we look at these other items on my timeline. Where did it go? It's right here. So the Salt Lake Temple gets dedicated. Later that year, in September, President Wilford Woodruff, President George Q. Cannon, Joseph F. Smith, and Elder Orson F. Whitney, Elder Orson F. Whitney went to the World Fair with the Tabernacle Choir, and on their way there, they stopped in Independence. They were welcomed by the people, including the mayor. There was a celebration. They visited the temple lot. The Tabernacle Choir sang. That happened after like almost immediately after the Salt Lake Temple was dedicated. So I feel like that draws another connection between these two places. But there's more. It's not just that. So they make that trip, and then just a few years later, just 4 years after the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple, the first branch was, since the expulsion, was organized in Independence. And the first branch president was Richard Preeter. Okay. 1897. Before I started studying all this, I figured there wasn't anybody in Missouri for a long time. I didn't know when the saints started returning or when the church started being organized in Missouri again. But it turns out 1897, just 4 years after the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple. In my mind, that's like really soon, but that's what happened. Okay, October 7th, 1900, a short time, quote unquote, before the October General Conference, the Church of Christ Temple Lot offered to unite with our church and the RLDS, which is now Community of Christ, to build the temple on the Temple Lot. And they talked about that in General Conference. You can pause and read this if you'd like. I've already covered this on the channel. So there was a chance to build it. Of course, that wouldn't work with our church and our theology. Theirs is different. And so we declined. Okay. 2 years later, that's when Elder J.G. Duffin, the person whose talk we're reading right now, and we're going to finish in just a minute. 2 years later, that's when the City of Independence reached out to him and said, hey, all this other temple land is now available if you want to purchase it. And then the next year, 1903, the first presidency authorized the purchase of temple land in Independence. And it just happened to be exactly 70 years later. Well, I don't know the day, but if we're just looking at years, 70 years after the expulsion from Jackson County, right? Because that happened in 1833. 70 years later, the first presidency makes the decision to go ahead and follow up on that offer from the year before. And this is new to my spreadsheet. I didn't know about the offer the year before. And then the following year, April 15th, 1904, the church purchased 25 acres of temple land in Independence. And then much later on, built the Independence Visitor Center. I was going to cover some of this. I don't think I'm going to. I do want to point out, I've made friends with the stake historian here in the Independence Stake, Sister Patrick, and she's provided me with a lot of good information. And I'm going to have to slowly comb through it and add it to my spreadsheets as I go. But it turns out that the Independence Stake was created on March 25th, 1971. It was created by President Spencer W. Kimball, who at that time was acting president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. It came from the division of the Kansas City stake. And what's interesting is you have this round number. This happened 140 years from the time that Joseph Smith identified Independence as the site for the city of Zion. I don't think that's coincidence. 140. You have a 40 in there. We know that 40 is an important number in the scriptures. And also we were just talking about the Salt Lake Temple being under construction for 40 years. But also you have the 1 and 4, which, you know, it makes you think of, for example, Joseph Smith. He was 14 years old at the time of the first vision. 14 is a multiple of 7. And so it's so interesting. Joseph Smith identifies where the city of New Jerusalem would be built. And you have all this that happens, the expulsion, but 140 years later, that's when the stake is created. I just think that is amazing. And then just a couple months later, that's when the Independence Visitor Center was dedicated to be a visitor center for now, but a temple later on, sometime in the future. But you see this flurry of activity right after the Salt Lake Temple, right here, after the Salt Lake Temple is dedicated. I tend to think that there were a lot of things that happened with the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple. And I think that not just because of what we're talking about, but if we go to my quotes A through Z spreadsheet, and we go to what's currently row 512 for Salt Lake Temple dedication prophecies, we learn that there were a couple things that happened specifically with the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple. Let's go ahead and read. Let's see, this is the one I think I always read. Let's read this. This is found in Doctrine and Covenants Student Manual, page 191. This is President Joseph Fielding Smith, President of the Church. President Joseph Fielding Smith, who was present when President Woodruff talked about these angels at the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple, recorded the following, quote, "One day, while I was sitting in the presence of my father, President Joseph F. Smith, back about 1908 or 9, somewhere in there, I called attention to these statements by President Woodruff, and I said I would like to go over the records from the time of the dedication of the temple up until now, and see what we can find in regard to calamities, destructions, plagues." And he encouraged me to do it, and so I did. So I went over the newspapers and over the magazines and jotted down year by year the destructions, the commotions among men, everything in the nature of a calamity. And to my great astonishment, each year they increased, and they've been increasing ever since I quit making that record. I was greatly astonished by it. And when I called the attention of one of my neighbors to it, he almost got angry at me and said, "Oh, well, we have got better facilities now for discovering these things. I don't believe it." And he is a member of the church too, but seemed to lack faith in these predictions. Okay, so the angels of destruction, and as we read in other places, it's referring to the angels that are mentioned in the book of Revelation that were at the four corners of the earth. And at first they were told, no, don't do anything until the 144,000 have been sealed in their foreheads. Those angels were released at the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple. Additionally, we learn from Elder Orson F. Whitney of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in the October 1917 General Conference the following. He says, "I wish now to refer to one of these men and to certain predictions that he made. I heard President Wilford Woodruff in April 1893, when the Salt Lake Temple was dedicated, declare that from that time forth, the Latter-day Saints would have more influence in the world, and their representatives would be treated with greater respect and consideration by their fellow men than ever before." And what's interesting is that's exactly what happened on this timeline and in this talk that we're reading, where the City of Independence reached out to the mission president and said, "Hey, here's temple land. It's up for sale now. Do you want to buy it?" And then when Wilford Woodruff went to Independence, the same, like later in the year that the Salt Lake Temple was dedicated, he pointed out that attitudes had changed so much, and he was so surprised by it. I'm not going to read it now. You can pause and you can read this if you like, but he notes that fact, how the last time that he was in Jackson County, this was after the Saints had already been expelled, but he was going through there for some reason. They had to hide in the cornfields and be very careful and not let anybody know that they were members of the church. So Salt Lake Temple, angel dedication, oh my gosh, Jared, let's get it together. The Salt Lake Temple is dedicated. Angels of destruction are released. From that time forward, the church would be treated with greater respect. And then almost immediately after, in just the few years afterwards, the church starts to return to Missouri, and specifically to Jackson County, and purchasing some of the temple land. So the big picture here is, what does this mean when it comes to the rededication of the Salt Lake Temple? I've talked about this concept before, but if all these things happened when it was dedicated, is it all going to come to a close when it's rededicated? Is the second coming going to happen immediately before, immediately after? I don't know. But I tend to think that all these things that we're talking about, they're going to maybe see their bookend in the rededication of the Salt Lake Temple. So, and that could very well include the temple lot. What if the temple lot comes back into the church just immediately before the rededication or immediately after? Or what if they announce it, like they announce the purchase at the rededication of the Salt Lake Temple? But I feel like these two temples are connected. The Independence Temple was the first one announced, and the Salt Lake Temple was the first temple announced after the Exodus to Utah. It's fascinating, to say the least. It's fascinating. Okay, so let's go back here and finish this up. I state this by way of encouragement to the saints. Not that I am particularly impressed that the time is here just now to do that work, though it may be, but to show the sentiment in that land from which our fathers were driven, and where our mothers and sisters were abused so shamefully. There are thousands of people today who would welcome you back with open arms. Yeah, it goes right along with what Wilford Woodruff said at the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple. And do all in their power to assist in building up the work of the Lord in that country from a worldly point of view. One word more before closing. A few days ago, I had business to transact in Kansas City with a leading manufacturer. After we got through our business, the question of our people going back to that country came up, and he said to me, "Mr. Duffin, it appears to me almost improbable that your people will ever accomplish the work that I understand has been predicted." I said to him, calling him by name, "You have done business with my people. You understand their integrity. Now, let your mind go back to the year 1847. The pioneers went into the Salt Lake Valley on the 24th of July of that year. A few days after they reached the place where Salt Lake City now stands, Brigham Young stuck his cane on a certain spot and said, here we will build the temple of our God. Today, the Salt Lake Temple stands upon that spot." It's so interesting because that's kind of another parallel between the Independence Temple and the Salt Lake Temple, is that even though the Salt Lake Temple was the first one to be announced in Utah, it took a long time before it was actually completed. And before it was completed, you had the St. George Temple, the St. George, Utah Temple completed, Manti, Logan, and then finally in 1893. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at announcements. I'm not sure when they were completed. I know that the St. George Temple was completed before the Salt Lake Temple. The fact remains, Salt Lake Temple is announced, but it takes a long time before it's finally finished. And that's definitely true with the Independence Temple. It was announced a long time ago, 1831. Here we are in 2025, but it is going to happen just like the Salt Lake Temple happened. And that's his point as he's talking to his friend. The idea was never lost sight of that temple would be erected upon that spot. And never has the idea been lost sight of that the city of Zion will be built where Independence now stands. And the temple of our God will be erected there. Well, said he, it may be so, but if it is, your people will exert a wonderful influence for hundreds of miles around. This is the sentiment of the people. I want to say that God is preparing the way for his work to be accomplished. The words of our beloved prophet at the opening of this conference are true. I know that Zion is growing and her borders are extending. I know that the work of God is established upon this earth and that it will ultimately prevail. I know that God lives and that Jesus is the Christ. I know that Joseph Smith is a true prophet of God, and those who have succeeded him have been and are the oracles of God, his prophets, and through them has come his word unto the nations of the earth. God bless you. Amen. So I'm so happy that I found this. I found it using this website, LDS General Conference Corpus. Uh, you're basically able to search everything in the Scripture Citation Index, but there's this window of time. I can't remember. I think from like 1888, I want to say, until 1942, that they don't have General Conference talks on their website. So that's where LDS General Conference Corpus comes into play, and you can search talks that way. I would normally pull it up on archive.org and look at the original, document, the thing that they printed it on. But for some reason, they don't have that one for April 1902. So that's why we're reading from this website. But I'm glad that I found this. It helps me put, it's just one more piece to this puzzle. There's a lot more I need to add to this, but it blows my mind. I mean, not that it's surprising necessarily, but it blows my mind to find out the details of the things that have been going on in the background when it comes to Missouri that I never knew about, and probably most of the church doesn't know about, unless maybe you live here and you're a history buff. You probably wouldn't know about these things. And I get the feeling that as we add more items to this timeline, maybe there's going to be more surprises. We'll have to see. But that's going to be for this one. I'll talk to you guys later.